My name is David Knowlton. I'm a professor of anthropology here at Utah Valley and someone who's perennially interested in Mormon studies. I also have the privilege today of introducing Alan Cooperman, who is one of the keynote speakers of this Mormon Studies Conference. Mr. Cooperman is the Associate Director of Research at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. Mr. Cooperman graduated Phi Beta Kappa, or magna cum laude, and was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard University, and then spent 27 years in very important positions as a journalist before moving into this research domain. I'd like to know about that shift. It sounds like a fascinating one, but that's another conversation for another time. The Pew Research Forum brings together a stellar group of scholars to do basic research, and in this case, research on religion and American public life. And they've been producing some of the most important studies with empirical data that have given us a slice of religion within America, within the United States, that is unequaled in its breadth and its depth. And so the time is really short, and so I'm going to cease talking much about Pew, although Lord knows I could certainly speak its honors for hours, nor am I going to speak about Mr. Cooperman and his stellar credentials. Instead, I'll let him speak for himself. My apologies for short introduction, but time is pressing. Thank you, Mr. Cooperman.
Thank you. If I need to go backwards? Just a quick audio-visual thing. You know, as a bridge to the last session, I'll tell you, a few weeks back, I did a presentation, and it was for C-SPAN, and I couldn't get my presentation to work, so C-SPAN never edits anything. So for 15 minutes, I was floundering around without a presentation, and then I learned to my delight that they showed it between 1:30 and 3 o'clock in the morning. So I felt good about that. I hope this one won't go quite so badly, and at least the time is better. So yes, I'm from the Pew Research Center, and the Pew Research Center is a non-advocacy organization, so we don't take policy positions. We do basic social science research, demographic research. I have come to talk to you today about Mormons, and I feel very funny about that. You know, Coles to Newcastle, here I come to Deseret, a non-Mormon, actually a Jew, to tell you about Mormons. But nonetheless, I hope that some of the data from the survey will be of interest to you, and we'll see whether any of it's surprising to you. It won't be at all bad if it's not surprising to you. After all, it is a survey of Mormons across the United States. So with that, let's talk a bit about this survey. We did it last year. We believe that it is the first nationally representative survey of Mormons all across the United States ever done by any organization other than the LDS Church. It's a random sample done by telephones and landlines and cell phones, highest quality survey methodology. Important to realize that when we talk about Mormons and who is a Mormon, we begin with a question in a religious context. And the question is, what is your present religion, if any? Are you Protestant, Catholic, Mormon, Orthodox, as in Greek or Russian Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, something else, or nothing in particular? And those who answer that question and say that they're Mormons are in this survey. Someone who would not answer that question by saying that they're a Mormon would not be in this sample of Mormons. So someone who was raised in the LDS Church but no longer considers himself to be a Mormon would not be in this sample. So that's an important thing to realize. This is a sample of people who call themselves Mormons. Okay. When we look at self-identified Mormons, we see very, very high levels of religious commitment. As sociologists of religion, there are a bunch of different ways we can measure religiosity or religious commitment. Among the best, works across all religious traditions and all around the world, is simply to ask people, how important is religion in your life? Is it very important, somewhat important, not too important, or not at all important? And we have measures, that question we've asked all around the world, and we have measures of religious commitment that works very well. And we can see that With Mormons, 82% of self-identified Mormons say religion is very important in their lives. In comparison, in the U.S. general public, it's 56%. And worldwide, that U.S. number is very high for industrial democracies. So the Mormon number is very high there. We also ask people how often they attend religious services. And 3/4 of Mormons say they attend services weekly or more. Again, self-identified Mormons, not everybody who's raised in the church, but those who would identify themselves to a surveyor as Mormons. 3/4 say they go to church each week. And more than 8 in 10 say they pray every day. Now, if you put those three things together and make a kind of scale of religiosity, we find that about 3/4 of Mormons fit all three criteria. That puts Mormons in the most highly religious, among the most highly religious groups in the U.S. population. It's possible you could come up with some small group, maybe a group of ultra-Orthodox Jews or a particular segment of evangelical Protestants that would match those levels, but you'd have to look pretty hard to find it. As you know very well, Mormons, while having high religiosity that is similar in some ways at the level of evangelical Protestants, maybe even higher, also have some distinctive beliefs. And so we had a series of questions aimed at determining the degree to which Mormons, in fact, self-declared Mormons, hold to some of these distinctive beliefs. And you can see it here in this slide. This is a sample of these questions. You can see that more than 9 in 10 say that God the Father and Jesus Christ are separate physical beings. You can see that 95% say families can be bound together in temple ceremonies. These won't surprise you. Maybe this is a little bit of an interesting question. Which is closer to your view, we ask people. Some teachings of the LDS Church are hard for me to believe, or I believe wholeheartedly in all the teachings of the Church. And we find a not insignificant minority, about 2 out of 10 Mormons say that they do find some teachings of the LDS Church hard to believe. But 3/4 say they believe wholeheartedly in all the teachings of the church. Now, we haven't asked this question of every other religious group in the United States, so I don't have a good comparison. I'd be interested in knowing what you all think. Supposing we took a group of Catholics, do you think that we would find that 3/4 or more of Catholics would say they believe wholeheartedly in all the teachings of their church? Those of you who think that we would find 3/4 of Catholics believe wholeheartedly in all the teachings of the church, please raise your hands. Okay, those who think we would find less than 3/4 of Catholics would say they believe wholeheartedly in all the teachings of the church, please raise your hands. Okay, well that was not a scientific survey. But it was fun, and that's also what I think. I think it would be hard to find almost any religious group in the United States in which 3/4 of its members would say they believe wholeheartedly in all the teachings of that group. One more question just to kind of get at this issue of what Mormons believe and of orthodoxy. And here the question is, should women be allowed to be ordained to the priesthood? I suppose we didn't say specifically the Melchizedek priesthood, but that would be the idea here. And I think what's really interesting about this slide is not only that nearly 9 out of 10 Mormons say, no, women should not be ordained to the priesthood, but you'll see that women are no more likely than men to say, women Mormons are no more likely than male Mormons to say that women should be ordained to the priesthood. Now, the margin of error in this survey is about 4.5 percentage points. So I wouldn't say that men are more likely than women or women are more likely. I'd say they're about the same. But the point is, women are not more likely than men to say that women should be ordained to the priesthood. So that's a quick overview of some of what we learned in this survey about degrees of orthodoxy among Mormons. It is sometimes said that the that the LDS church is an all-in or all-out church. Either you buy it and you're active, or you're out. And that it's in that sense, some ways, perhaps different, it is said, from other faiths in which there are more, say, cafeteria Catholics or more ethnic or cultural Jews, that sort of thing. So one of the issues here is, is indeed that true about Mormons? Or are there, in fact, substantial numbers of cultural Mormons, ethnic Mormons, Mormons who identify as Mormon by heritage, by upbringing, or by some part of their belief, but who are not fully active in the church or don't wholly adhere to the church's teachings? And I think what we're seeing in these slides, it's a taste of what we have in the survey, is that, yeah, there's some of that. There's some of that in every group. But on the spectrum, it appears that indeed the LDS church is more of an all in, all out. At least what we're finding here is that the people who self-identify as Mormon show a great deal of orthodoxy. That doesn't mean, however, that they think that all of the teachings are of equal importance, right? So Mormons may say, I believe wholeheartedly in everything the church teaches, but they may think some things are much more important than others. So we tried to get at that here, and we asked people, what is essential to be a good Mormon? What's important but not essential? And what is not so important? And here, in this slide, I don't know whether any of these numbers will surprise you, but to me, the 73% who say that helping the poor is essential to be a good Mormon is a very interesting number. Again, I'm not sure whether we would find that with all other religious groups. And it does jive with what some other sociologists of religion have found in other studies. I don't know whether you're aware, Ram Kanan at the University of Pennsylvania recently came out with a survey that they did. He presented it actually at the Pew Research Center's offices in Washington. And he surveyed an even more, if you will, active, inherently group. He went into LDS wards on Sundays and interviewed people after religious services. And he asked them about their levels of volunteering. And he found that the average Mormon volunteered something in excess of 400 hours a year. By comparison, the average American who volunteers, not the average American, but the average American volunteers about 50 hours a year. So he found Mormon levels of volunteering to be off the charts. We also know from U.S. Census data that the state of Utah has the highest rates of volunteering of any state in the country. So there's good reason to believe, indeed, that this helping the poor is a distinctive feature of Mormonism. Of course, it's not only Mormons who believe in helping the poor, but that's a very interesting number. The 49%, roughly half, say not drinking tea or coffee, word of wisdom is essential. But again, the other side of that coin is that about half are saying the word of wisdom here is not essential, though they may say it's important. Tithing. So in Ram Kanan's study, he found something like 90% of Mormons of the group that he surveyed. In our survey, again, self-identified Mormons by telephone, about 8 in 10 say they tithe. Now, we didn't ask gross, or exactly what they meant by tithe, but 10% of income. By way of comparison, studies generally estimate that about 5 to 7% of the American public tithes, and there's some evidence that may have gone down in the recent economic downturn, and maybe around 4% today. So 4% perhaps of the general public tithing, 20 times that percentage among Mormons. Let's talk about politics. Mormons are overwhelmingly conservative. They identify themselves as conservative, far more than the general public. They're overwhelmingly Republican, won't surprise you. You know the demographics as well. Mormons represent about 2% of the U.S. population. Looking at this audience, not surprising to say, Mormons are overwhelmingly white and non-Hispanic. Upwards of 8 in 10 are white and non-Hispanic. About a third live in the state of Utah alone. About 7 in 10 live in the Rocky Mountain West or the Intermountain West as a whole. Sometimes one of the issues in sociology of religion and the study of religion and politics is what people call the in-group effect. Would you vote for, if you're a Jew, would you vote for a candidate because they're Jewish, be more likely to vote for a candidate who's Jewish? If you're a Catholic, would you vote for John Kennedy? Upwards of 8 in 10 Catholics did vote for John Kennedy. One of the things we see with Mormons is that they're overwhelmingly conservative, overwhelmingly Republican. There certainly must be an in-group effect, but it's clear that simply being a Mormon is not enough for a politician to get the support of a majority of Mormons, as you can see from the 3 politicians we asked about. Other markers of conservatism, not just political conservatism, but social conservatism. A question we asked, nicely balanced question, would you prefer a larger government that provides more services or a smaller government that provides fewer services? We don't give people, by the way, that, oh, I'd like a smaller government that provides more services. That's not really the option here. It's a nicely balanced question. It does give us a sense of where people stand on that spectrum. Republicans, as you would imagine, across the board, tend to be more likely to support small government. Democrats more likely to support large government, and so on. Mormons very strongly side with smaller government. Also, on a question of whether homosexuality should be discouraged by society or should homosexuality be accepted by society. Those are the 2 sides of that coin. Mormons almost twice as likely as members of the general public to say homosexuality should be discouraged by society. Interestingly, though, it isn't true that Mormons are more conservative on every possible social issue. For example, immigration. And one of the interesting things here, Mormons just about the same as the general public, about half in support, about half say immigrants take away our jobs, and about half say immigrants strengthen the U.S. with their hard work and talents. Mormons who have served a mission are, maybe not surprisingly, even more likely than Mormons as a whole to say that they support immigration, that immigrants strengthen the United States with their hard work and talents. So few other measures of morality, cohabitation or fornication, sex between unmarried adults. Mormons don't like it. Abortion, Mormons more conservative than the general public. Alcohol, far more conservative than the general public. Divorce, very close to the general public. Okay. That's it for a quick look at Mormons and Mormon orthodoxy, Mormons and politics. And now we get to what I think is really the most interesting part of this survey and a big reason why we did this survey. After all, we did this survey in what people are calling the Mormon moment. The Book of Mormon, musical, Big Love, Romney and Huntsman. So how are Mormons feeling about all this? At the time we did the survey last November, 2 Mormon presidential candidates being taken seriously. On the other hand, Big Love, Book of Mormon. So, how do Mormons feel? Are they feeling accepted? We've arrived? Or are they feeling people don't understand us, they don't really respect us, they're making fun of us? Or some combination of both. You saw in an earlier survey some evidence about what the general public knows about Mormonism, and I can give you far more fine-grained data about that if you're interested. But this is not what the public says they know about Mormons, but what Mormons say the American public knows. And 62% of Mormons say the American public knows little or nothing about Mormonism. And it's about 2 in 3 Mormons say the American people as a whole do not see the Mormon religion as part of mainstream American society. Mormons also perceive a fair amount of discrimination. Now, they don't necessarily think they're the most discriminated against group in society. Mormons perceive that there's greater discrimination against gays and lesbians and against Muslims. But Mormons perceive more discrimination against Mormons than they do against blacks, against evangelicals, or against atheists in American society. I'll leave that slide there just for a moment because it's pretty interesting. Okay. And in particular, it's very interesting to me at least, the relationship of Mormons to white evangelical Protestants. We already saw that Mormons have very high levels of religious orthodoxy and religiosity, religious commitment, similar to white evangelical Protestants. We've seen that Mormons are overwhelmingly Republican and conservative, similar in that regard to white evangelical Protestants. These would seem to be two groups that are very akin in American society. But while Mormons virtually unanimously consider Mormonism to be a Christian religion, about half of white evangelical Protestants in our surveys do not consider Mormonism to be a Christian religion. And Mormons know this. Mormons feel this. Mormons think evangelicals tend to be unfriendly to Mormons. 50% of the Mormons in our survey said evangelicals are unfriendly, and nearly 7 in 10, roughly 7 in 10, said evangelicals are either unfriendly or neutral. It was only about 18%, about 2 in 10 Mormons who think evangelicals are generally friendly. Now compare that to non-religious, because the point is that Mormons don't think everybody else out there doesn't like Mormons. They don't perceive nearly as much animosity from simply non-religious Americans as they do, frankly, from evangelical Protestants. Mormons also think that the portrayal of the LDS Church in television and movies is not only wrong, but actually harmful, hurts society's image of Mormons. More than half tell us that. And by the way, I don't have slides on it, but I do have it in the survey. We asked this about a variety of other things. We asked, for example, about the press. And Mormons don't think that the press, generally speaking, is negative toward Mormonism. A lot think the press is generally neutral or friendly toward Mormonism. It's more this view of Hollywood as being a problem. At the same time that we've seen that Mormons feel a lot of discrimination, that they think that the general public doesn't know much about Mormonism, that they think that Mormonism is not accepted as mainstream, we see overwhelmingly Mormons think that the American people are becoming more accepting of Mormonism. And that's not only true for Mormons as a whole, the top bar. The reason I put these other bars in the slide is you can see that it's true of Mormons all around the country, whether they live in the West or not in the West. It's true of young Mormons and older Mormons. And by the way, it's true of female Mormons and male Mormons. All segments of Mormon society feel that acceptance of Mormonism is on the rise in America today. This question, is the country ready to elect a Mormon as president, was asked last fall in this survey in the context of these other questions about acceptance of Mormons. So this question ought not to be understood as Mormons thinking or handicapping of the Romney, say, election bid. This isn't Mormons saying, we think Mitt Romney will win. This is Mormons saying, we think the country is now ready to elect a Mormon president, and more than half do so. More than half think the country is ready to elect a Mormon president. So on the one hand, there's a lot of discrimination. Mormons don't feel accepted. They think the public doesn't understand them or know much about them. On the other hand, they think things are on the rise. And last slide in the general presentation here, and I do have some more detail I can go into. Mormons are pretty optimistic in general, pretty happy with their lives. They are more satisfied with their communities than the general public, they answer this question about satisfaction in their lives a higher percentage than the general public. Generally speaking, religious people across the board, people who are higher in religious commitment, also tend to be more satisfied with their lives and more satisfied with their communities. In that sense, Mormons very much fall into that pattern. So now I'd like to open it up for some questions, and if you're interested in knowing more about what the public actually knows or thinks about Mormons, I have some of that, and I also have a little bit of data on the internet, but not specifically on Mormons and the internet. So with that, please. Yes? While we're waiting, I'll tell you that there have been 2 states so far in the Republican primaries for which we have enough Mormon voters in the exit polls that we can analyze how Mormons actually are voting. Have you all seen this data? Because it's pretty interesting. Let me just flip. I know I've got it written here someplace. In Arizona, 88% of Mormons voted for Romney, and in Nevada, 96%. Those are extraordinary numbers, by the way. Those are high. The 96% is affirmatively higher than the percentage of African Americans who voted for Obama last time around. Go ahead, if you got a microphone.
Yes, I have a question. I might have missed this because it went very fast, but what I saw at the bottom of one of your slides, it looked like it said 25% of Mormons disapprove of divorce, 29% of the general population disapproves of divorce. Was that correct?
I think that's right,
And
yes.
if so, I was surprised by that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I wouldn't make anything of the difference. That difference is within the margin of error, so I would say that Mormons are about the same in their views of divorce as the general public. Not significantly different.
That in itself is a major cultural shift. Sorry.
You know, one of the things we could do on a question like that is look more specifically at men and women. We could look at Mormons in various parts of the country. But I don't believe that there was anything that jumped out at us on that there was any particular part of Mormondom that was more strongly, say, disapproving of divorce. And interestingly, in divorce on the general public, it's not what you might think. It's not necessarily that older people are more disapproving of divorce than younger people these days.
What determined the way in which you shaped your questions, like the wording specifically, because that probably affected how people did it? At the bottom it talked
Question
about
wording definitely affects how people answer the questions.
Did you give the option of do not answer or
Oh, yes.
things like that?
Yes,
Or
there's a don't know. That's why a lot of these numbers don't add up to 100%. There's a don't know or refused option on every question. So it's a complicated issue. When we do a telephone survey, we don't want to try to keep people on a telephone too long, or we'll lose people and we'll end up without a good sample. So we try to limit to about 20 minutes on the telephone. And we have to ask a bunch of basic demographic questions about people's age and gender and ethnicity and that sort of thing at the back. So it squeezes down. We have a limited number of questions, and we put enormous amount of effort into every question. In surveys, the golden data is not a one-time answer. It's seeing a trend over time. So the most important thing you can do with question wording, if you have a question that you've asked in the past, is to ask that same question with identical wording in the same context and see how the answer changes in the general public. Now, this survey was specifically focused on Mormons, so there were quite a few questions that were specifically about Mormonism, and we don't have trend data on that. But all the questions about religiosity, the questions about large government, small government, questions about abortion and divorce, those things, we ask those the same ways that we've asked them again and again and again. And that's why we can make valid comparisons to the general public. And that's why really the most interesting thing is not just the percentage of Mormons who answer a question a particular way, but how that is like or unlike the general public. Because I could write an abortion question that would get a higher or lower percentage of people in favor of it, depending on exactly how I wrote it. And I can write a question about, anything, and I can push it one way or the other. We try to make the questions as neutral as we can, and we try, most importantly, to keep our trends. That's really the gold standard. Now, in terms of the questions on Mormonism, how we worded them, we worked with an advisory panel. Some of these names you'll probably know. Have you heard of David Campbell from the University of Notre Dame, who was co-author of the book American Grace? He was one of our advisors. Matt Bowman, the historian. Allison Pond from the Deseret News. Terrell Givens. Marie Cornwall from BYU. And John Green, who's not a Mormon, but is one of the leading sociologists of religion in the United States. So those 6 folks were our advisory panel on this, and they worked hard with us in developing the questions.
This is great objective information that we've received and that you've shared with us. But I have a more subjective question, and that is, what have you learned about Mormons?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I went to high school with a Mormon, and he was my roommate. I went away to high school, and so I have had a close attachment to a Mormon family since I was a young kid, and I also like to ski. So I come out here pretty much every year, and often tends to be at conference time. I don't actually go to conference or listen to conference very much. But I've had kind of broad exposure to Mormonism over the years, in addition to which I was a religion writer for the Washington Post for 5 years. So all the folks that were here earlier, the people they work with, Mike Otterson and others, I know them pretty well. I've talked with them over the years. So this survey was not by any means a fresh exposure to Mormonism for me personally. But speaking kind of as a sociologist of religion, or someone who's, I'm fascinated by the interplay of religion and politics in the United States. There were some things that were really interesting to me. I genuinely did not know what percentage of Mormons would say they wholeheartedly believe all the teachings of the church. When I see the result, I say, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. I'm not really surprised by it, but going in, I really had no idea. There are certainly folks out there, including Mormons, people, including some of the speakers at this conference, who think that if you were to do a survey of all the people on ward rolls, rather than a survey of people who self-identify as Mormon, you'd have a much different result. You'd find a much higher percentage of people raised in the faith who no longer follow the teachings of the faith, or say they wholly believe the teachings of the faith. Let's see what else. The political findings didn't really surprise me. We have some data in the survey on Mormon social networks, where we ask what percentage of your friends are Mormon. All, most, some, or almost, many, some, few. And you can correlate that with regions of the country. And you see that Mormons who live in Utah, it's a really pretty high percentage who say that most or all of their friends are Mormons. That's a kind of interesting degree of insularity by comparison with other religious groups. I think you could find pockets of other religious groups, but not such large pockets. I mean, if you went into certain parts of Brooklyn, sure, you'd find Jews who've lived their whole lives among Jews and have never met anyone who isn't Jewish. And if when you went into certain steel towns in Pennsylvania, you might find people who are Catholic who only know other Catholics. But to find a very large population where more than half say that most or all of their friends are of the same faith, that's fairly rare in America today, I think. So that was kind of interesting. Questions?
Actually two. One is about the lie factor. I conjecture that Mormons, maybe more than other religious groups, are concerned about a positive public image. How do you account for those who may be lying to one level or another? And secondly, yes, no, do you have data about how the general public does, in fact, view Mormons as compared to the data you showed us this morning.
Thank you. I'm going to slip you a $5 afterwards because I really appreciate that second question because I'm eager to show you some of that data. But the first question, really, if I understand it correctly, is, well, are people telling you the truth when you call them up on the telephone and you ask them these things? And the answer is kind of yes and kind of no. Simply put, we think of it as a social desirability effect in surveys. And we know that some types of questions have more social desirability attached to them. That is, the person on the other end of the phone wants to please the person who's answering the question or thinks they ought to answer the question in a particular way, and therefore they're more likely to do so. And survey research has focused a lot of attention on this. You might not be surprised to know that if you do a telephone survey and then a live survey of people, you will find that women tend to underestimate their weight and men tend to overestimate their height. Right? So we can actually measure those things. We also know, for example, that in the general public in the United States, it's nearly 40% of Americans who say they go to religious services every week, at least once a week. And that number's been steady for a long time. That's the percentage of people who say they go to religious services every week. It's not the percentage of people who go to religious services every week. And there have been some efforts to try to correlate those things. It's really tough. It's actually very tough to come up with an accurate figure of what percentage of Americans really do go to religious services every week. But the best estimates are something like 20 to 25%. And 40% say they do. But again, what you saw in this survey is comparisons of what Mormons say to what members of the general public say about their levels of religiosity. Now, on some of these things, I don't think either members of the general public or Mormons are so inclined to dissemble or lie. On others, they may. On tithing, Mormons, I don't know, you would know better than I. Or do you think if we call up someone on the telephone, it's an anonymous survey, there's no name attached, and we say, do you tithe? Do they feel like, well, I really ought to tithe, so therefore I'm going to say I tithe? Or are they pretty accurate about it? In either case, even if they're dissembling a bit, or maybe if they're not doing a full tithe or whatever, they're tithing on something less than what somebody else might think would be appropriate, still, those levels are very, very high as compared with the general public. I don't know whether that's a full answer. We can't then say to people, hey, really? we don't do that. We really we respect our respondents in surveys. Okay, let's talk about the general public. So here's I love this set of questions we asked because it puts Mormons in context. We asked people whether you would be more likely or less likely to support a candidate for office who is X, or would it make no difference, or, as the person asked, do you not know or not care to answer? And some of the things we asked about are things that it turns out people feel are positive traits, and some are things that people feel are negative traits. And in this slide, they're organized by the difference between the margin between the positive aspect of a question and the negative aspect of a question. So you'll see, for example, being a woman in the general public, 14% of people say they're more likely to support a candidate who's a woman, and 7% say they're less likely. So you have a little bit of net positive effect for being a woman. For having served in the military, you have a very large net positive effect. You have almost nobody says they'd be less likely to support a candidate who served in the military, and nearly half say they'd be more likely to support a candidate who served in the military. And at the very bottom, you'll see 60%, 61% say they're less likely to support someone who is an atheist, does not believe in God, and virtually, almost nobody who says they're more likely to support, 5% more likely to support, or had an extramarital affair. There are 2% who are more likely to support a candidate who's had an extramarital affair, but 46% who are less likely to. So where are Mormons? Now, I'm going to be a little flip about this. let's have a laugh together, please. I don't mean this to be disrespectful, but being a Mormon candidate is the functional equivalent in American politics of having ever smoked marijuana. You see that 2/3 of the public says, and thank you for laughing, 2/3 of the public says it wouldn't make a difference. But 25% of the public will hold it against you. And a very small percentage, 5%, will affirmatively consider it in your favor.
It's probably a different 5%.
That may be a different 5%. Although, I don't know, they get up to some monkey shines in the Rocky Mountain West. You know, yeah, it could be the 5%, it could be the Jack Mormons. I'm just kidding. So anyhow, what's kind of nice about this is it puts it in perspective, and you can see that in American politics, without a candidate's name, this is a generic question, a candidate, not a specific candidate, you can see that being a Mormon is a net detriment to a candidate. But it's not nearly as much of a net detriment as being a homosexual. And by the way, that homosexual move, we've asked this question more than once. So we can see how this has changed over time. We asked the same question in 2007. And the percentage of people who say they would be less likely to support someone who's homosexual has dropped. It's dropped significantly just in the last 5 years. Mormon is about where it was. It hasn't really changed in 4 years or 5 years. Let me just continue with a couple more slides about the general public and then take another question. So another interesting question. This is not the same survey as the Mormons. This is a general population survey and a pretty good-sized one. And we simply said to people, what one word best conveys your impression of Mormons or the Mormon religion? And you'll see that the single most common response, but this is their own, there's not a set of response options. It's what's called an open-ended question. They can say whatever they want, and then we're trying to categorize it. So the most common single answer was cult. Now this just by the timing of this, you'll see took place, you see down at the bottom, in November. It was only a few weeks after Reverend Jeffress's remarks. So that probably had something to do with it, the commonness of cult. But I want you to pay attention to the second most common answer, and to the fifth most common answer, and to 28 people who said dedicated, and to 19 who said devout. And I want you to realize that we're getting a really interesting pattern here. It's not all negative. The most common single answer is negative, but it is not all negative. There are a bunch of very positive impressions that are mixed in here. And there's also some kind of impressions that I don't know whether they're positive or negative. They're sort of neutral, like conservative or strict or devout or interesting. So it's a mix. Now, that 100 out of 2,000, so that's about 5% of the general public, said some version of cult. Among white evangelical Protestants, 11% gave the cult answer. So we can see some differences there. Also, in 2007, the most common single answer we got was polygamy, not cult. But also in 2007, the most common second most common answer, was family or family values. So there's some consistency there, and I guess what I draw from that is that in the general public, there are two broad impressions about the Mormon faith. One is quite negative, cult, polygamy, etc., and one is rather positive and is especially associated with family and honesty and devotion. Okay, and just one more. How much does the public actually know about Mormonism? So I think one of the earlier speakers said they'd done something that found that about half the public knows little or nothing. And indeed, that's the same that we find. We find that this is self-assessment. This is when people tell us, how much do you know? And we say, do you know a great deal about Mormonism? Some, not very much, or nothing at all. And we find that about half the public says they know a great deal or some, and about half the public says, I know not very much or nothing at all. And thinking about the social desirability of it, how easy is it for someone to say on the telephone, I know nothing at all about that, or not very much? So I don't think people tend to dissemble so much. I don't know. on that not know much. I think that that's a pretty honest self-assessment. Half of the American public saying they know not much or nothing at all about the Mormon religion. Also, is Mormonism a Christian religion? And you see that in the general public, it's about a third who say no. Now, remember, we saw earlier that among white evangelical Protestants, it's about half who say no. In the general public, it's about a third who say no, about half who say yes. We also know that the answer to that question is very strongly correlated with general views' favorability of Mormonism. Those who say Mormonism is a Christian religion are much more favorable than those who don't. And another way of getting at this, it's very hard to ask people and get an honest assessment of their view of other religious faiths. People don't want to say bad things about other faiths. So one of the ways we can get at it, we think, is by asking, how similar is another faith to your faith? And we ask it about a variety of faiths, and we see people rating the faiths that they are more comfortable with, that they think more favorably of, as more like their own faith. And faiths they are not so comfortable with or think not well of, they'll say are less like their own faith. And here we find about 2/3 of the general public says that Mormonism is very different from their own faith. Yeah, I think I had a question in the back here.
On the previous slide, I noticed that polygamy was, the fourth one down, was listed separate than multiple marriages and wives. Is there a reason that was listed separate, or just the way it was categorized?
Yeah, it's our categorization of an open-ended question, and it's a very difficult thing to categorize open-ended questions, and you're absolutely right. The way we could categorize it by lumping things together, we could make one category look bigger or another. We try to do it as best we can and try to stick with the actual words that people are using. But you will see, polygamy, and then some people will say bigamy. So we put those two together. Strict, restrictive, we put together. You can play with these however you like. Again, I wouldn't take these as direct percentages, and that 100 is not 100%. That's 100 people out of 2,000. That's 5%. So the most common single answer was cited by 5% of the people. But again, it's kind of interesting that among white evangelical Protestants who answered the question, it was twice as high. It was 11%. Yes, ma'am. No, you. Yeah.
I was just curious on the next slide, the one that you showed after this.
Yeah.
If you control for those who admit that they don't know anything about Mormonism, does that change the percentage who think it's Christian or not?
That's very interesting. So it used to be in 2007 that we found that there was a strong correlation between how much people said they knew about Mormonism, whether they knew a Mormon, and whether they thought Mormonism was a Christian religion. And that's not so clearly the case now. And I think that one of the things that's happened is that I think that there is a substantial portion of conservative Protestants who think they know a lot about Mormonism and don't like it. And I think that that's what's skewing it. And I can actually show you what people do know. So the last was let me go back a slide. This is self-assessment. Half of the public saying they know little or nothing, half of the public saying they know a great deal or some about Mormonism. We also did a survey in 2010. I loved this survey. It was a factual survey, a very difficult thing to do, to ask factual questions and see what percentage of people got them right. This was a selection of just 3 questions from that survey, the 3 questions that concern Mormonism. One of the questions was the Mormon religion founded before the year 1200, between the year 1200 and 1800, or after the year 1800? 44% of the general public knew that Mormonism was founded after the year 1800. Now, we asked another question. According to the Book of Mormon, where did Jesus return? Where in the Book of Mormon, where does the action take place, essentially? I can't remember the exact wording. And we gave him a few options. And we deliberately left the Middle East as not a response option. And 40% correctly named the Americas. Okay? And then we had a series of questions in which we asked about various people. And we asked, do you happen to know what is the religion of? And we asked about a particular person. For example, we asked about Mother Teresa. And nearly 9 in 10 Americans know that Mother Teresa is a Catholic. By the way, 4% of Americans think Mother Teresa was Jewish. Just to show you, you can get any percentage, you can get a percentage of people who think anything. A much harder one was Maimonides. It was 9% of the public knew that Maimonides was Jewish. And by the way, it was something in the order of about 60%, a little more than 50%, but less. It's about 60% of Jews knew that Maimonides was Jewish, right? And imagine if there weren't 15 medical centers named after him. Now, Joseph Smith, about half of the general public know. I mean, this is as simple a question as you can get, right? No, what religion was Joseph Smith? Well, actually, you could make it, you could make it more complicated, and people could say, well, before he founded whatever. 51%, including, by the way, nearly 100% of the Mormons who answered the survey, got it right. I mean, you have people arguing over some of these questions. They'll say, well, Joseph Smith wasn't Mormon, whatever. We also had people argue the Jewish Sabbath doesn't begin on Friday because, I don't know, they had some convoluted way of it. And I just pointed out to them that 94% of the Jews who answered the survey said the Jewish Sabbath begins on Friday. So I think it's a pretty good answer. But yes, questions, please. I saw a hand start to go up over there. Oh, yeah, okay.
So, is the microphone on? Okay, so you've shown us something that doesn't surprise us, that there's a predominantly conservative Republican presence in the LDS Church. I guess I'm wondering how the Democrats feel about that. So do you have any data on satisfaction in the church or feelings of alienation for different people, and if people who are, say, Democrat or liberal are a little less comfortable?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have that. I could try to dig for it. I'd be worried that I would quickly get to small samples. So we have 1,000 Mormons in the sample. If Mormons are, let's say, 8 in 10 Republicans, so that's 200 Democrats, I start slicing it before long. I don't have enough to really talk about. We would never talk about any part of a subsample that has fewer than, say, 100 individuals in it. We'd actually want more than that. But again, part of the other part of the question will go back to that: who is a Mormon? So our definition here is self-identification. No litmus test of beliefs, nor are we going into churches, nor are we pulling from ward rolls. We're getting the folks who say, in answer to a question that's clearly in a religious context, what is your present religion, if any? Are you blah, blah, blah? Those who say they're Mormon. So it could be that if there are folks who were raised in the Mormon faith, and for one reason or another, politics could be part of it, are alienated, they might not answer Mormons. It's also true, by the way, we have a fair number of folks here who are telling us there's discrimination against Mormons. Mormonism is not fully accepted in society, etc. So isn't it possible that some folks answered that question, I'm a Christian? Isn't it possible that some Mormons just say, I'm a Christian? So we actually drill down and try to get some of those folks back, the ones who say they're Christian. But if you do an open-ended survey question across the United States about religion, and you don't have any response options, you get a higher percentage of people who say they're just Christian, and you'll get a slightly lower percentage of people who say they're Mormons. So that's why there's some difference in the estimates of the percentage of the country that in fact is Mormon. I'm going to do one last slide very quickly, because this is a conference about religion and the internet, and I want to show you that 40% of Americans say they are active in religious organizations. That is, they belong to religious organizations. It's not a measure of how religious they are. It's a measure of how often or to what degree they belong to religious groups. And people who belong to religious groups are then, we find, far more likely to also belong to all kinds of other groups, virtually any other kind of group you ask. And these differences are statistically quite significant. So people who tell us they belong to religious organizations are also much more likely to belong to professional or trade organizations. They're also much more likely to belong to veterans organizations. They're also much more likely to belong to performance arts groups and alumni associations. So the way I'd sum it up in a simple word is I'd say joiners are joiners, right? They're people who are inclined to join something are inclined to join things, right? So we know that about people who are more religious, that is, at least more religious in the sense of more likely to belong to religious organizations, are also more likely to participate in a whole lot of other things. Okay, so then I hope this will surprise you, because we don't find that people who are more likely, who belong to religious groups, they are, in fact, no more likely to use the internet, to use email, to use social networks, to do text messaging. People who are involved in religious organizations do all those things at about the same rate as the general public. And I'd be very interested. Maybe you all have a good explanation for it. I don't have a simple explanation. I think it's something of a conundrum. It means that joiners in kind of the real world, but joiners are not necessarily more likely to be joiners in the virtual world. And I think that for religion and the internet, and this is not specifically about Mormons, this is just about all religious folks across the board in American society. But I think it's kind of interesting. Anyway, thank you all very, very much.